Hi everyone, from what's been a sunny day in Birmingham in the United Kingdom. Um, my name is Nathaniel Barron and I teach sociology at the University of Birmingham. And today I want to tap into the conference theme of ontological aspects of critical theory. And I want to do that by discussing the topic of utopia and critique in Ernst Bloch's social ontology. So just quickly, thanks to Saba for organizing the conference, and yeah, for giving me the opportunity to share this paper with you. So the broad starting point of my paper is really the idea that contemporary critical social ontology is kind of undergoing an attempted revival or renaissance of Georg Lukács and his work. And what that means is also simultaneously we're therefore witnessing a kind of subterranean dismissal or marginalization of utopianism, and by dint of that, a kind of lack of serious engagement with Ernst Bloch, who developed his own response to Lukács's kind of critical assessment of utopianism in history and class consciousness. And Bloch is an interesting figure, not only because he developed a kind of counterposition to Lukács's critique of utopianism, but also because Bloch was actually quite a formative figure for Lukács's own development of an Aristotelian Hegelian Marxism. So the starting point for my paper is that if Lukács is indeed a figure who kind of instantiated one of the 20th century's most significant ontological turns in social thought, so then when we review all the evidence, which we can't do here today, but if we were to do that, we'd be pretty confident that Bloch is undeniably crucial to this Lukácsian turn, and yet he tends to be marginalized. My aim in this paper is really to problematize this contemporary return to Lukács precisely on this site of Lukács's devaluation of utopianism. And I want to question whether we really, given our contemporary moment, whether we really should be devaluing utopianism. And this is because Bloch's lesson for us today with regard to utopianism is that, unless we supplement Lukács's more material kind of immanent understanding of society or social being with the importance of utopianism, then we tend to concede utopian longing to reactionary forces. And so, in our own time, if we're witnessing the rise of right-wing populism across the world, I want to try and show how Bloch's utopianism in critical theory, has something fruitful to offer in overcoming this kind of lurch to reaction. So that's the general sort of starting position. The paper's kind of structured in three ways. It begins with Lukács's critique of ontology. It then very briefly deals with contemporary scholarship, which I'm going to argue kind of repeats Lukács's dismissive line regarding utopia. And then I want to come to Bloch's position, his counter critique, if you like, and show how that's useful for us given our own present social being, if I can put it that way. So why is Lukács kind of dismissive of utopianism? Why does he think it really contains a real lack of critical potential for social transformation? Well, we can turn to history and class consciousness, where mention of utopia is made regularly often. And we can also just briefly note that, when Lukács refers to utopia in that text, he's often implicitly referring to Bloch. So what's the problem with utopia for Lukács, particularly in the workers' movement? Well, for Lukács, utopia is really a symptom of an effect of a current impossibility within social being to see society as a whole. So it kind of represents a kind of fragmentary vision of social totality. And obviously Lukács will link this to the rationalization thesis developed by Weber and so on. And Lukács will refer to the utopian syndrome, which infects the workers' movement with a kind of hollow, he says, an impotent dissatisfaction with present social being, but it's hollow because it's just abstract desire to alter or change that being. It's never really developing any kind of concrete proposals for action. And it can't do that, Lukács says, because as utopian content, it's really a kind of unmediated content with objective social possibilities, which is what Lukács wants to understand and what he frames totality around. And because it's unmediated with objectivity, essentially, it's subjective. Utopian content is subjective, and it's therefore unable to kind of read off from its fragmentary vision of social totality any concrete course of action. And so Lukács will speak about the need for the workers' movement in particular, of course, to progress from utopia to reality. And essentially, Lukács betrays a number of assumptions when he talks about utopianism, as we may have gathered from what I've just said. He thinks that utopian content, the projections, the utopian images, projections of perfect societies, let's say, he thinks that content is opposed to the materiality of present social reality. He thinks it's recalcitrant or alien to it. And therefore, he doesn't really think that utopian content can really give us any kind of proper knowledge of social reality, and therefore is unable to really, like I said, suggest any course of action, when we consider that knowledge for Lukács also includes praxis. So Lukács associates utopia with a resolution of the irrationality of present social reality merely at the level of imagination. And because it's merely at the level of imagination, it's subjective, and so it leaves untouched the irrationality of social being. It's really not transformative at all. So that's kind of Lukács's critique, very quickly stated, of utopianism. What's interesting about Lukács, though, when you read History and Class Consciousness, is that his sharp distanciation from utopianism as a kind of credible aspect of critical theory didn't kind of result in Lukács turning a blind eye to the real effectivity in social life that utopianism plays, despite its kind of a-revolutionary content or capacity, let's say. And I just want to quote quickly a passage in the text at a little bit of length here. So Lukács writes, and I quote, "It would be foolish to believe that this criticism of utopianism and the recognition that a post-utopian attitude to history has become objectively possible means that utopianism can be dismissed as a factor in the proletariat struggle for freedom." And Lukács will go on to say that utopianism in this sense is only really overcome when the working class achieve a kind of real unity of theory and praxis. And he goes on to say that this isn't a kind of a leap, as it were. It's kind of a slow evolutionary process. It doesn't happen at a single stroke, he says. Now, the problem here with Lukács's position, which I just want to draw attention to, is that he both recognizes the kind of persistence of utopian content despite its critique, while also completely devaluing its content as having any role to play in social transformation, or any, let's say, highlight here, any positive social transformation, although he doesn't distinguish between the two really. He just says that utopian content is a hindrance to revolutionary movement. So to anticipate Bloch's projections, we can say that Lukács, insofar as he kind of discards utopian content, is restricting his understanding of social totality and the effectiveness of certain modes within that totality, and that's something important that I want to kind of come back to later. Okay, I hope I'm not moving too quickly, but there's quite a lot to get through, I guess. So next, I want to turn to recent scholarship in critical social ontology, just to really point towards this idea that Lukács's line is often repeated in that work. So I just want to turn to Michael Thompson's recent work in social ontology, which is particularly interesting because it emphasizes and kind of seeks to renew the intentionality and socio-teleological dimension of Lukács's critical social ontology, but it's equally emblematic of Bloch's marginalization. And this is because Thompson kind of rightly captures the proper purport of Bloch's critical contribution as kind of residing in ethics or more broadly in values, or what Timothy Hall would call perhaps a kind of concern with the good and worthwhile life. And Thompson even kind of acknowledges that Bloch kind of laid out a fruitful starting point for integrating a kind of ethical vantage point into Marxism. But despite all this, and whenever Thompson kind of mentions Bloch, it's very brief anyway, but despite all this, Thompson ultimately kind of objects to Bloch in the same manner that Lukács does, primarily with reference to Utopia. Thompson will kind of distinguish between Bloch's more abstract project of social transformation with Lukács's critical approach, which confronts, and I quote, the material organization of society. So not these kind of transcendent projections, if you like, but what's really going on in present social being, and the kind of possibilities included with that material organization of society, which of course is important. Thompson kind of repeats that Lukácsian line, and this is kind of reaffirmed when Lukács also refers to and kind of supports Lukács's low estimation of expressionist art, which, due to its kind of aesthetical fragmentation, is unable to conceptualize the whole of totality, and so it's kind of utopian art in that respect. By totality here, Thompson means, expressionist art is unable to really see the material organization of society. So it can be noted in passing that Bloch associated Lukács's unappreciative assessment of expressionism and its experimental art with Marxist left's tendency to kind of disavow utopian longing and ceding that ground to reactionaries instead. However, Thompson's work is also interesting because it kind of does touch on the importance of utopianism at the same time. And he does this when he refers to the indispensability of elaborating new ontological social forms in the struggle for emancipation. So as well as providing a kind of what Bloch would call a cold critical account of material conditions, of the material organization of society, Thompson also is talking about an indispensability of elaborating, i.e. projecting, let's say, new ontological forms, and that this is important in the struggle for social emancipation. Now Thompson doesn't refer to Bloch when he talks about this, and he doesn't really unpack what he means, but he has at least touched on, in my view, the importance of utopianism, and that importance is now something I want to turn to in the final step of the paper, where I look at Bloch's review of history and class consciousness. So Bloch's review of Lukács's book was published in 1924 and is entitled Actuality and Utopia. And if you remember, I mentioned earlier that Lukács's problem with his critique of utopianism is that he kind of acknowledges the persistence of utopian content while also kind of suggesting it's completely irrelevant to social emancipation. Now, in Bloch's review of Lukács's book, he refers quite comically to, I quote, the miserable logic of the yes, but. So Lukács is right in a way, yes, but there's a problem here. And Bloch basically says that Lukács's drawback, or the drawback of his position, is that it leaves unanswered what precisely the practical critical theorist is to do with the seemingly redundant, though still persisting in existence, utopian content. Utopian content is still pervading social being, but it's irrelevant, but it's still there. So we could pose the Leninist question to that content of, well, what is to be done with that utopian content when it's both there but irrelevant, so-called irrelevant? Kat Moore, who's recently translated into English Bloch's review of Lukács's book, frames the issue here in the following terms. So she writes, and I quote, "The problem with all of this, Lukács's position, from Bloch's perspective, is that, or was that, the proletariat very obviously did have ideals that motivated it. Okay, and however distorted or partially it may be, these ideals did manifest the proletariat's desire for a better society." Now, I'll come back to that point about proletariat in a minute, because Bloch kind of applies the importance of utopian content to other classes within capitalist social being. But for now, I just want to draw your attention to the fact that Bloch kind of sees Lukács's idea of or notion of totality as a kind of peculiar agnosticism, he calls it, which he writes, and I quote, "is undoubtedly a kind of timidity before what is hidden, and it kind of exudes a kind of responsible attitude before what is secretive, and it kind of develops a strict need for, you know, the hiddenness within social being for its limitation." Okay, end quote. And so Bloch is kind of really trying to get at this idea that Lukács develops quite a narrow conception of what social totality is. And he writes, and I quote, "The practice of Lukácsian concretization never fully satisfies the sensitive, endlessly experimental being of history, the richly intertwined deep relationships of the reality process," end quote. So I guess the problem here in Bloch's eyes is that Lukács essentially restricts social totality in such a way as to render utopian content completely irrelevant and unusable. And the problem with this for Bloch is that it really, as I mentioned before, it really just leaves that content to reactionary forces. And Bloch, and this is kind of where Bloch applies utopian content not necessarily to the workers, but to the peasantry and to the petty bourgeoisie. And he does this primarily in another work, not the review of Lukács's book, but in another work called In the Heritage of Our Times, where he attempts to show that it was the fascists who were able to tap into this transformative potential of utopian content, this desire for something vaguely different. And this was because the Marxists of the period surrendered that content, which existed in present social being, to reaction, and kind of went along the lines of a more purely, not necessarily Lukácsian, but more kind of purely direct, more pure direction of cold critique, as Bloch would call it. You know, this idea of just critiquing present being in terms of material organization. So that's kind of, that's kind of Bloch's problem there with Lukács, is that we don't really want to concede that utopian content to reactionary forces. So Bloch suggests that instead of merely dismissing as irrelevant or kind of just unmasking utopian longings, we need to kind of re-inherit their categories that are being put to use by reaction in order to kind of orient them more away from counter-revolution towards revolution. And this is what Bloch will call the warm stream of critique. So I'm not going to kind of sum up the ideas there. I'll just leave it at that, and thank you for spending your time listening to this. And I look forward to discussing any questions that you might have or points that you might want to make in the Q&A. Thank you so much.